welcome to another session of AP Human Geography Review with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to be looking at the peripheral or the galactic city model as a pattern for urban organization. So the reason that I gave you two names there is really this particular model is known by two names. You have what's called the galactic city model or the peripheral model. In a lot of cases, I prefer one name over the other, and I actually prefer the peripheral model in this one, mostly because of the indication there of this around the periphery, this beltway. And we'll talk more about the beltway as we go. But let's just go over some of the basics of the model first. First, it was developed by a geographer named Chauncey Harris. You see that's 1997, so relatively recently. If you remember that name, or if that name seems familiar to you, it's because he's actually one of the individuals that helped to develop the multiple nuclei model. Maybe I should have put this a little bit further up. But anyway, he's one of the folks who developed the multiple nuclei model, and so in an effort to update that particular model, he decided to develop the galactic city model, the peripheral model, because he felt like it was a more accurate representation, not necessarily of cities historically, but the way that cities were starting to be developed and the patterns that they had started to see in more modern American cities. Just like a lot of the city models that we've been talking about here in the recent past, after World War II, and it's the same with this case, the peripheral model is going to be, it's going to really require independent transportation. In order for this particular model to develop, individuals are going to have their own independent modes of transportation, and that's what allows them to spread out, and that's what allows them to come into contact with so many different spaces in such a wide range of spaces over the space of the city. And the other thing that's important about this particular model, and it's really the only one in all of the models that we look at that's going to incorporate a beltway. So that beltway simply is a road that runs around the city. And you're not necessarily the city, but really kind of the urban space. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So in a lot of American cities nowadays, we have interstate highways that run around the cities. In Atlanta, we have the Highway 285. And anytime you see those three numbers there for an interstate highway, that's always going to represent a highway that begins and ends in the same state. And a lot of those interstate highways around American cities, they're going to be the interstate highways. So they're larger. They allow for more rapid movement around the city for those who maybe not necessarily going into the city, and it also allows you to interact with the space that's around the city. At least it's supposed to, kind of hypothetically, for those who get on 285 every day. You know that that's not necessarily going to be the case. So I put the multiple nuclei model here just so that we could do a real brief comparison. So you'll notice that basically, kind of on a basic premise, the peripheral model and the multiple nuclei model are almost exactly the same. We have a separation of spaces in terms of activity. You have kind of the central point, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But you'll notice you have the separation of the different types of activities. And it's essentially what you have in the peripheral model. Now, if you took the beltway and added it to the multiple nuclei model, that's essentially what you would have. Now, notice some of the differences. Notice here that in the peripheral model, you don't have a separation in the different types of residential spaces. This simply says suburban residential area, whereas in this down here, the multiple nuclei model, you actually have several different types of spaces. So you have the higher residential income, you have the kind of middle class, and then the low class, or the lower income individuals here. Now you still have the separation of spaces like the industrial park, heavy manufacturing here, which now on this one is kind of out here. Oh, that's an airport complex, isn't it? But you do have industrial district. That's number 4 here on the map, which kind of comes out here towards the edge of the peripheral model. Okay, so you still have the separation of spaces, but this is just necessarily considered a suburban space instead of the different types of residential areas. The other thing we'll notice is that in the multiple nuclei model, it is called the central business district. Notice here it is just simply called the central city. And so this, if you think of this model as kind of what's happening inside the city, so this is the city as a whole, this is kind of the urban region here for the peripheral model. Being from around the city of Atlanta, you think of this as maybe downtown Atlanta, and then these are all the kind of the outlying cities that are still a part of that urban space. So whether we're talking about Sandy Springs, or we're talking about Buckhead, or we're talking about Decatur, or we're talking about some of those other cities that they're still cities, but they're kind of in there and a part of the continuous built up urban space. So that's really where we're going to get some of the main differences between the peripheral model and the multiple nuclei model. So some other things that are important to notice for the peripheral model is that, and I've mentioned this already, but the spaces are still separated. So you still notice that we have all of the different activities that we're participating in are in separate spaces. And again, a lot of that has to do with the independent mobility, and a lot of it is because of the cheaper land area that exists kind of on the periphery of the urban space, and also the fact that you have people that are living out kind of out in this direction. I think another model that does a good job of illustrating this is the urban realms model. Okay, and so you have these different realms that exist here on the periphery, and again, they're able to be here because of the beltway. But again, the thing to pay attention to is that this separation is based primarily not necessarily just on socioeconomic status, but rather the different types of activities that exist around the urban space. Here again, we see that this is considered the central city. We're not talking anymore in this model about the central business district, because the central business district essentially has been split up and put, or at least portions of it have been split up and put in different parts around the old city. So you have the shopping mall area, which is indicated by the threes that are out here, which of course we talk about the decline of the shopping malls today. But anyway, you have the service center that exists out here. You have the combined employment and shopping center, which is out here. And those are not necessarily the specific places for them, but it's just the idea that all of these different activities that used to take place in the central city are no longer necessarily there. And so you really have it's really operating in a different kind of way. It's operating in a different kind of way than it has in the past. So that's what this point here for, is that a lot of the activities are actually broken away from the central city, and the activities are taking place outside the central city, but you're still able to access all those activities because of the different transportation networks. And so in this, we're talking about the beltway that allows you to do that. The other thing that's important about the peripheral model is its illustration of sprawl. And so there's a lot of conversation around urban sprawl and the negative effects that it brings. And really, this is one of the best models that's going to illustrate that particular concept. Not necessarily the problems that sprawl brings, but what sprawl looks like in model form in terms of the way that the different types of activity spaces are spread out. And so that's one of the complaints about sprawl, is that pretty much what we've done is we've segregated all of our activities into different spaces. And so we have to travel longer distances. It creates traffic and congestion, taking up prime agricultural land, destruction of natural habitats and resources, and those kinds of things. So I really feel like this particular model does the best job at that. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but it may be one of the only ones that it makes an attempt at trying to illustrate the concept of sprawl. So there you have it. That is the galactic or the peripheral model. Again, it is an important model, especially being one of the more up-to-date models in terms of what our modern American cities are going to look like. So I hope you found that helpful. And as always, I hope to see you next time.